Guys, welcome to my studio. Thank you for stopping by. Again, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. If you find value in this specific video, please give me a thumbs up as it helps the algorithm. Now today we're going to talk about these two cameras, and it's not so much of Nikon Z9 versus Nikon Z6 II, but it's this camera or this camera and for what specific case use. Now, I built this video based on lots of questions that I've been asked on my channel previously. When do you want to use Nikon Z6 II? When should I be using Z9 versus Z6 II, and different case uses? Or should you be waiting for cameras such as Z8 or Z6 III or Z7 III? So please note, this is not a comparison video because these are two different cameras for maybe different applications. Sometimes there's an overlap. Now, full disclosure, this video is not sponsored by Nikon or any other camera store, but I own these two cameras. I purchased them with my own money. There is no specific bias for me for any of these cameras. I really like them both. Both cameras produce professional type of results, but I want to talk about specifics of these cameras. Now, both cameras produce beautiful results, Nikon colors. I would suggest that you use chapters below. This is probably going to be a little bit longer video because I want to make sure that I cover as many different questions and scenarios as I can. So let's dive right in. Guys, one of the most important things that I really want to discuss, and it's going to be all the way towards the end, is when you're using these cameras, you want to be able to pair them up with different type of lenses to address different types of photography situations that you might be in. So let's start with the very first one, is Nikon Z9. This is a $5,500 camera. It is a flagship made by Nikon that was released was announced last year in 2021, was released this year. I own this camera for over 10 months by now, and I've been using it for professional work as well as personal work. I also own this camera since the time it was released back in 2020 for over 2 years. I've gotten a lot of use out of this camera, and again, I love both of them. Now, this is certainly a lot less expensive. Currently, around the holiday time, this camera comes at about $1,900 that you can get on B&H or Amazon. This is a 24 megapixel beautiful sensor, produces beautiful results, and I really can't say enough of good things about this camera. Certainly, this is a much higher grade. This is a 45 megapixel BSI stack sensor, and that's the big difference, okay? Stack sensor, and it's super fast camera. The big difference between these two cameras is that this one has only an electronic shutter, while Z6 II has electronic and mechanical shutter. I'm gonna link a video up to my left, or maybe as well in the description box, as I've done a video comparing these two cameras and the results of the Z9 electronic shutter versus the mechanical shutter of the Z6 II. Now let's do a little bit of a walk through the body itself. So Z9 and the Z6 II, they all have mic input, they have a headphone jack, they have HDMI. The difference about the Z9 has a full-size HDMI, okay, while the Z6 II has the, I guess they call it the mini HDMI. So right over here. It's much easier to use, larger HDMI ports. This one has a 3.2 inch articulated screen. As you can see, the only difference, this one has also tilts this way, okay, that you can use it for portraiture work. Now this one does not do that, okay, that's the difference here. But again, for people who mostly do photography, this is usually enough. The camera comes with Z9 comes with two CF Express type cards, okay, all you can use XQD cards. Z6 II comes with a CF Express / XQD card, but also one SD card. And that's maybe one of the benefits if you're transitioning, if you are just dabbing into Nikon mirrorless and you want to start with something smaller such as Z6 II. You only can, you can transition all your SD cards that you previously used on other cameras. So in what scenarios do you want to use this? Let's say, which camera should I use for landscaping? So I would start with, now Z9 has a 45 megapixel sensor and it has ISO of 64 to 25,600. Z6 II has ISO from 100 to 51,200. Okay, so this one is probably going to be a little bit better in a low light for the long-term situations if you need a higher ISO. For landscaping, because it's a 45 megapixel sensor, this is going to be a beautiful camera, but you can also use Z6 II. Now, how about weddings and different kinds of events? Okay, so I am actually coming from a standpoint of a wedding and a portrait photographer. Again, both cameras can perform absolutely beautifully. The IAF on any of these cameras, certainly Z9 has much better IAF. Z6 II has a really good IAF. Now, it may struggle a little bit in a low light situations. However, I've used this camera on weddings. I use this camera for different kind of events and portraits. Photography, it works very well. So this camera, actually, if you use two of these cameras as opposed to just one with different types of lenses, and I'm going to talk about the lenses actually toward the end of this video. So I suggest that you either scroll down to all the way to the end or just sit around and listen. For weddings, I really actually suggest using this camera, Z6 II. Now, which camera would I use for in-studio work or fashion work? So again, both cameras will perform very well for in-studio work as well as for fashion work. You're just gonna have a much higher megapixel count, 45 versus 24. It's a little bit easier to work maybe with the smaller files. Both raw files are gonna grade very well if you're using RAW specifically. And when it comes to studio work, fashion is great. Now, how about concerts work? If you want to do portraits or videos, I think very similar situation. It's typically a low light photography, but when you're taking pictures of somebody who is on a stage, typically, those subjects are well lit. So I would suggest, if your budget allows, certainly go for the Z9, but within the budget and the good lenses, Z6 II will do a great work, whether you do photo or video. Now, how about for product photography? Which camera would I use? For product photography, people typically use a higher megapixel sensor. So in this case, I would suggest Z9. However, since I don't have this camera, but it's going to be very similar, you can use Z7 or Z7 II. It's kind of a camera that fits right in the middle between these two cameras, because it has a 45 megapixel sensor, not a stack sensor like the Z9, but it has the same megapixel count. So my suggestion to you is that you use Z7 or Z7 II if you use a camera for product photography. Now, what camera would I use for kind of everyday walk around, maybe like a street photography? I certainly would recommend that you go with something like a Z6 II or even Z6. This camera I think is going to be a little bit too large for you to use when you're walking around. Yes, this camera is great ergonomically. If you're using in this fashion, basically you're holding it. But for everyday use, everyday carry, it's smaller, it's lighter, it's great in your hand. Initially, I thought that ergonomically this camera may not be the best for people to use. However, after using it for quite a while, the grip is excellent. Yes, my pinky kind of has no place, but I think after a while I really adjusted to this one. You can certainly get a battery grip that will help you with ergonomics as well. But for everyday use, Z6 II is the camera to go with. Now, okay, what camera would you use for action and sports photography? And this is where kind of the direction is pretty clear. Z9 is the tool of choice, I would say. Z9 has 20 frames per second when it comes to shooting in RAW, 30 frames per second when it comes to shooting in JPEGs. With the firmware 3.0, this camera has 60 frames per second, and that's going to be in a DX mode, and you're going to be taking about 19 megapixel frames. And you can also go with 120 frames per second, which is absolutely crazy, but that one is going to be 11 megapixel JPEGs. But again, with so many frames, I don't think you want to have higher megapixel count than 11 megapixels, because otherwise there's going to be too many pictures, too many files to go through. Sports photography, wildlife photography, this is just really an action beast. Now, if you are kind of on the sidelines and you're taking pictures of your kids, maybe it's a smaller field and you don't have as much action, you know, maybe your kids are playing like I don't know, 10, 12, 13-year-olds who are playing soccer or maybe baseball or basketball, and you can certainly use this camera. I have personally taken a lot of pictures of my kids using Z6 II. Where, you know, yes, there is a speed, you know, with the small kids, but it's not nearly as, you know, professional soccer, professional football, professional basketball, where you really, athletes are so fast and so agile that you need cameras such as this. So, at the end of the day, yes, Z9 is the tool of choice, but Z6 II is not a slouch when it comes to, you know, tracking some subjects and kids and, you know, in that fashion. So, but at the end of the day, Z9 is the tool of choice for action in sports. Now, let's talk a little bit about the IAF, right? So, both cameras have kind of pin area. It's very fine when it comes to focusing option. Single point on both cameras works very well. Both cameras have wide area AF and small area AF. Auto area AF kind of function very similarly. Now, Z6 II has auto area for people and animals, and it actually works very well. Z9 is a little bit more advanced when it comes to those things, has also custom area AF, where you can actually choose your area where you want to focus. AF subject detection on the Z9 is absolutely spectacular. It has a people, basically humans, it got one for animals, and it has one for automobiles. Now, you can also choose one mode, basically includes all three of them, but it's going to prioritize people, animals, and automobiles if you are kind of operating within the environment where all those elements are present. So, but it has absolutely amazing IAF and just autofocus tracking on this Z9. You will not be disappointed when it comes to using that camera for that specific reason. And certainly one other autofocus function that I want to mention with this one is the 3D tracking. I used it on sports. I used it for some bird photography, although I will admit I'm not a birder. There are a lot of photographers out there who use this camera specifically for wildlife. But when it comes to sports, 3D tracking on this camera is spectacular. I mean, be able to take a ton of frames per second, be able to follow the subject. This camera is beautiful when it comes to, you know, tracking people, and highly recommend to use this 3D mode. In fact, personally, when I'm using at sports somewhere on the field, I use a 3D tracking primarily, and even when I do photography of basically portraits, 3D tracking actually works very well, and it's a great mode on the Z9. All right, so now I'm coming back to talk a little bit about the video features of these cameras. So let me start with the Z9, and I'm gonna admit this camera is absolutely a powerhouse, because the camera has no 30-minute record limit like Z6 II has. The camera shoots 10-bit RAW, H.264 in 8-bit. Z6 II also shoots H.264 in 8-bit. The file size and the quality actually is similar when it comes to you looking at that level, but this is where the difference stops, and the Z9 literally goes up into, you know, much higher level of quality of recordings. So you're looking at H.265 8-bit and 10-bit for the Z9. You have a ProRes 422 at 10-bit, ProRes RAW HQ 12-bit, and RAW at 12-bit, 4K up to 120 frames per second, which means you have a 60 frames per second in 4K, you have 120 frames per second in 4K. Z6 II will also shoot in 4K up to 60 frames per second. And honestly, for most people, this is all you need. You don't need higher than that. The Z9 is gonna go up to 8K of 30 frames per second. And now keep in mind, both of these cameras have no crop in these features, in these modes, and that's the amazing thing. With the Z9, there is no overheating issue. There's a really good way to dissipate the heat within this camera. Obviously, a larger body allows for that function. Z9 has waveforms built in. Z9 has a screen red outline on the camera actually when you're recording, to make sure that you don't forget to record, and it clearly stands out. You have zebras on the Z9. You have view assist with monitors. In other words, when you're recording in some kind of a flat profile, or you're recording in NRAW when everything is kind of washed out, well, if you're using a monitor assist, it will actually give you much more approximated normal kind of feel and look of what the final image is going to look like. You have a screen ratios of 3:3, 4:4, 1:1, 4:3, 2.35:1, and 1.85:1. Again, so if you're looking to use this camera for really professional recording type in the studio somewhere, for filmmaking, for commercials, this IAF combined with all the features that are in this camera will absolutely blow you away. So again, I use these cameras personally for all kinds of events. The Z9 is amazing. Now, if you're just using the camera for talking heads, just like I'm doing right now, both cameras will do absolutely beautiful work. For IAF, when you have an object or subject properly lit, like I am right now, with kind of coming from the light from the outside, you will have no problems. The Z6 II is going to be a great camera when it comes to a B-roll camera. You can use it in combination with the Z9, but again, I use these cameras for many different situations when it comes to video. I use both of them, both performed very well. The Z9 will have a ton more options and possibilities for you, and the frame rates and the quality of the image itself. So, but again, if you're using for recording talking heads like I am doing right now, Z6 II will do a phenomenal job. There's a number of videos on my channel that before I actually had the Z9, I recorded with the Z6 II, and I had no problems whatsoever. Now, one feature that was added with the Z9 was the digital zoom. Basically, when you're recording using proper lenses, actually will double your focal length. So if you are using a 50mm lens, it's going to go to 100, basically twice as long. If you're using an 85mm, it's going to go up to 170mm. So that function is available with a Z9, and I don't think any other cameras in the market actually have that specific feature. So it is interesting, it's very useful. It makes your prime lenses now function as your zoom lenses. So if you did not know that, Z9 can do that. Now, if you want to record some kind of music videos, again, this camera Z9 is going to be a powerhouse for those options, because you have more options that actually most people use. So depending on your use case for the music videos, Z9 is going to outperform the Z6 II for sure. If you're using documentaries, if you need a flat profile, if you're going from the outdoors to indoors, the Z9, I would suggest definitely this is going to be a tool for the job. However, the Z6 II will serve and work very well as a B-roll camera when it comes to recording documentaries. So the question is, should I wait for the Z8? Should I wait for any other camera? Honestly, this is the only The only person who can answer that question would be you, because you know your budget, you know your use case. What you should really be asking, what lens should I get with any of these cameras? What lens should you get for any of these cameras? And this might be more important to answer than actually what camera you should get, or whether you should wait for the Z8, whether you should wait for Z6 III or Z7 III. I really highly encourage you to think about it, what lens that you need to get. So let's talk about camera combinations with either of these cameras and what you should get and for what situation. Now, if you are doing event and wedding photography, I honestly would suggest that you go with the Z6 II, and let me tell you why. Now, if you use this camera with 35mm f1.8 and maybe 85mm f1.8, Z lenses, Z camera, the whole package would cost you about $3,300. This alone is going to be a lot less expensive than just getting Z9 by itself. You can actually get an additional Z6 II for wedding photography and those two lenses, and you're going to be really happy with using those two lenses, 35mm and 85mm Z lenses. You can also use a cheaper lenses, more like an F-mount lenses, for example, such as this one with an FTZ adapter. This is an 85mm lens with an FTZ adapter, and you're going to save even more money and virtually get very similar results for wedding and event photography. If your budget allows, you can certainly go for the Z9. However, because of the image quality, 24 megapixel sensor on this camera, you will have no problems coming away with amazing portraits of your bride, of your groom, of your wedding party. I use this camera for events, for weddings, and it did not let me down at all. So when it comes to saving money, using Z6 II is a great place to start. Now let's talk about landscaping. So if you landscaping photography or landscape photography. So if you're using for landscape photography, I would suggest that you take Z6 II and pair it with a 24-70 f2.8. This is a great lens because it gives you, it's a very versatile lens, and it has a very, I guess I want to say, proper or more acceptable focal range between wide of 24 millimeters and all the way down to 70 millimeters. You can certainly go with the prime lenses, but typically when you do landscape photography, you're going to be stopping down to f4, f5.6, and you really don't need prime lenses for that purpose. This lens itself, 24-70, is really going to substitute for you 24 millimeter lens, 50 millimeter lens, and a 35 millimeter lens. Okay, so I would suggest package of these two, and it's going to cost you about $4,000 as opposed to going with the Z9. Now, if budget is not a problem, you can certainly go with a Z9 for landscape photography with a 24-70 f2.8, and that package is going to be pretty expensive. It's a $7,600 package. Again, if you take a current prices right now that's on the market on the B&H or Amazon, and you take advantage of the holiday sales, this is what you're going to walk away with. You could for landscape photography, because it's a not fast shooting sort of situation, you can get away with easily with a Z7 or Z7 II with this 24-70 lens, and you're gonna do just fine as well. Okay, but you can certainly use these two 24 megapixel sensor, because I think about how often are you actually gonna print, how often do you need that level of detail. If this is your bread and butter and this is how you get paid and you sell your portraits and your landscapes, or maybe it's a seascape, yeah, 45 megapixel sensor, maybe this is what you need. But Z6 II has a very good dynamic range, and it's really good for landscape photography. All right, so let's talk about sports, wildlife actions. and kind of action sports. So Z9 is certainly going to be the preferred choice. I would suggest picking a 70 to 200 f2.8. You can go with an F mount. You would need an FTZ adapter, such as I have it on this 85mm. Okay, and it's really gonna work your Z lenses. F mount lenses. It's gonna make them work very well. If you're looking to get much higher into sports and you're considering like a 400 f, 2.8 or maybe 400 4.5mm, in that case, I shouldn't be giving you a lesson, because when you're spending that kind of money, you're most likely to know exactly what you're going to be doing. So, but sports and wildlife, 70 to 200 with a Z9 is going to do an amazing job, and but that's going to be the recommendations for sports and wildlife. Now, how about street photography? What would I recommend? I think in this case I would recommend something like a Z6 II because it's a smaller, it's not as bulky, it's not as heavy as the Z9, and I would recommend 24 to 120 f4. That lens is much smaller. It's actually much cheaper than any of these, specifically any of these lenses that I have, 24 to 70. And you can go with something like this, which is cheaper, 50mm f1.8s lens, and you can couple this with the Z6 II. I actually have done one of the videos not long ago when it comes to the street photography on streets of Montreal, and I used combination of these two. But if you're looking more for versatility and different focal length, I would suggest that 24 to 120 f4, and that whole package is probably going to cost you about $3,000. But I think you're going to be very happy with that combination. Now, how about video work? What kind of lenses should you couple your Z9, maybe let's say if you're using, or Z6 II? Well, at that point, it really depends on type of work that you do. Do you need more of a zoom lenses? Do you need prime lenses? Prime lenses actually going to work very well, especially coupled with the new function firmware update 3.0, when you can actually turn your you can turn your prime lenses into zoom lenses where you have a digital zoom. In that case, it's really up to you, but certainly 24 to 70 is going to be a good lens, because it's a low aperture, but it also has a very versatile focal length, 24 to 70. So, but for video, you can use all kinds of lenses, and I think you're going to be happy with whatever combination you pick for your specific use case and your videography style. Now tell me guys, what are you shooting with? What kind of photography you do, or videography? What kind of lenses and combinations that you are using in your situations? Because I would love to know. I think a community, videographers and photographers on this channel also would love to see. I know I personally read all of your comments, and my subscribers, I hope you read those comments as well, because I frequently see there goes a lot of discussions within the comments. So please tell me in the comments below what cameras you use for what use cases, and what lenses do you pair them with. Now, there are obviously a lot of things that I did not discuss right now. Things like FTZ adapter, I didn't have a chance to talk about that yet. F-mount lenses and third-party lenses. I did not talk about various accessories or maybe flash photography that I have covered in some of my previous videos. But again, guys, there's so much to discuss when it comes to these two cameras. I cannot recommend them highly enough to whoever is using them. Okay, as I'm just mentioning, these are my personal cameras. I paid for them. I did not, nobody gave them to me for review. And I have a really, really good experience using both of these cameras. So guys, I hope this information was educational for you, as well as maybe entertaining. If I was able to share some nuggets of wisdom with you and my experiences, and if this is helpful to you, I ask you that you subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. I ask you that you hit the like button if you found something that was informative to you, because it tells me and it tells the YouTube algorithm that there was something valuable in this video. This will help me to make more content and better content like this for viewers like you. Thank you.